Hello and welcome to revision tips for CIPS Level 4 Diploma in Procurement and Supply. This is Module 4 Ethical and Responsible Sourcing, and it's Learning Outcome 3, which is to understand compliance issues when sourcing from suppliers. So we're going to look at the key legislative, regulatory and organisational requirements when sourcing in not-for-profit, private and public sectors, and then compare the key legislative, regulatory and organisation requirements when you're doing it from international suppliers. So we're going to focus on the additional considerations for sourcing within different sectors of our economy. So there are different and specific requirements relating to the public, private and not-for-profit sectors. But regardless of the sector, all the applicable legislation needs to be adhered to. So in all sectors, discrimination should be avoided and all suppliers should be treated equally, respectfully and in a transparent approach. So let's review the advantages and disadvantages of competitive tendering. So the advantages is it should be fair, so suppliers should be treated equally, giving stakeholders the opportunity to understand capabilities of many suppliers. It will save time and money running one competitive tender versus separate, reducing the potential for any biased selection, encouraging suppliers to be competitive to win the contracts, and a greater chance of finding a suitable supplier if several are invited to tender. But the disadvantage is it may prevent a quick selection of a preferred supplier and drive the wrong behaviour in suppliers, encouraging low bids. And it can take time to validate and assess multiple tenders. Now, all organisations, whether you're in the public, private or not-for-profit sector, will need to follow the laws of the land. And they're based on, different countries have different regulations and different laws. But the key areas of regulation that exist must be followed. Let's refer to what's on the slide. So we've got things like data protection. They cover the movement, storage, ownership and distribution of personal data like names and addresses. They're the ethical practices, and these regulations govern and promote fair practice between organisations and their customers, preventing bribery and corruption, as well as the exploitation of slave labour and human trafficking. Health, safety and environment and workers' rights regulations will demonstrate a country's commitment to caring about their workforce, ensuring that workers have the right to work without prejudice and they suffer no injury in the duty of carrying out their work, enjoying a suitable balance of work and leisure time. Marketplace competition regulations are designed to regulate fairness in the business and trading, while promoting and facilitating competition within different markets. Product safety regulations govern minimum safety levels or quality of a product that should conform before the sale within their country. Now, we know the public sector exists for the benefit of society in general, and purchasing within this context is often relating to services or products that will be used by the public. They're not there for resale. Performance measures are around service levels and they're based on factors like waiting times, service quality or frequency. Now, because the public sector spends our money on our behalf, a regulatory framework exists which seeks to ensure that purchasing takes place in a transparent way, which can be examined with clear links to ensuring that purchases are fit for purpose and value for money and the opportunities for corruption are eliminated. Conversely, the private sector has as its prime purpose commercial activities that's often funded by borrowing for the purposes of making a profit for the shareholders. Now, competition is key here and secrecy is often an element. So just comparing these two, the private sector and the public sector. So public sector, they're owned by government on behalf of the state. They represent us, the public. Their activity is financed via taxation to achieve defined services, and traditionally there's little or no competition. Their constituency is concerned with stakeholders and they're really wide and diverse. It's basically everybody. With the private sector, these are owned by their investors and controlled by managers. funded through investment, revenue and debt, with the purpose of making a profit, and competition is key. And their constituency is by serving the firm's shareholders, customers, employees. Now, in the UK and many other Western nations, the public sector, which could be taken to include military, the health service, corrective services, police, the national and local governments, and its executive departments. And there's a myriad of semi-autonomous agencies to which it outsources its activities collectively, and this forms a very substantial market. But as public services are dealing with money provided by the general public, these organisations have to provide higher levels of transparency and accountability in their financial dealings than most private sector organisations would. And in addition to that, many other organisations have a stake or interest in how their money is spent and allocated. And many are happy to make their concerns very public. Now, for this reason, public sector procurement takes place prior to Brexit within a framework of UK and EU procedures and legislations, which seeks to ensure that the public gets value for money and that procurement process is fair and transparent. The sector is generally subject to tighter budgetary constraints than a private business, which can often find an extra bit of money for an opportunity that's too good to miss. But it should be noted at the time of recording this, we were still a member of the European Union. So their challenge is that they have an overall objective of defining service levels, a wide range of stakeholders, meaning they have to source lots of different things from lots of different places. So they're going to establish good sourcing strategies, but following those procedures and legislation, and often subject to budget constraints and cash limits. Now, the options for tendering, you can see on this slide, will have different timings. It's very difficult to see, actually. You might need to pause it. The open procedures at the top. This is used for well-specified requirements and where there's no need to pre-qualify your bidders. Many suppliers could submit a bid, which could result in lots of bids to assess. So really, the open procedure is only normally used where the number of potential bidders is expected to be relatively low. But what you need to give them is a minimum of 35 days to respond to a tender, which can be reduced to 30 days if you're using electronic submissions. The restricted procedure is a two-stage process, and that's used where the interest from the supplier is likely to be high. The buyer initially assesses the technical capabilities of its suppliers to determine which suppliers will be able to meet the evaluation. And what you can see from that is that stage 1 needs a minimum of 30 days, which you can't reduce, whereas stage 2, minimum of 30 days, which can be reduced to 25 days if it's electronic. The negotiated procedure is used in some circumstances, but can be perceived as limiting competition, so it must be carefully used and only when justified. Again, you've got similar procedures and timelines to the restricted in terms of the 30 and 25. Competitive dialogue procedure is very similar to the restricted tender as well, but it includes a period of time during which the buyer and the supplier are permitted to meet to discuss the specification. So initially you need 30 days, but there's no timeline specified for the final tenders. An innovation partnership may be used to develop a buyer and supplier to take an idea through the development process into production. You need 30 days, very similar timelines actually to restricted and competitive procedure with negotiation. It's 30 days and then it can be reduced to 25 if you're using electronic submissions for the second stage. Now, the stages of UK Public Contract Regulations 2015 go through 3 general stages. So you've got the specification stage, which describes the requirements. And here you're meant to avoid using brand names. I mean, you can say something like this make or equivalent so that you're not, limiting competition. Avoid your favoritism and define your performance requirements using performance specifications. but you need to clearly specify the production methods if necessary. In the selection stage, you need to review the evidence of the previous sanctions, any criminal convictions or offences, or any known poor performance, excluding any unsuitable suppliers. And at this point, you would review the financial standing and technical capabilities of the remaining suppliers. The award stage, the contract should be awarded to the most economically advantageous tender, which is often abbreviated by the word MEAT, M-E-A-T. And this is generally based on price, but quality and other factors are linked to the contract and they should be considered. But beware, abnormally low tenders should be investigated. So we're now going to look at the economic sectors in the private sector. So we have the primary sector, which is concerned with the extraction of raw materials, including agriculture and mining. The secondary sector, for manufacture of goods and constructions. The tertiary sector, which is your high street online retailers and service providers such as law firms. And the quaternary sector, which is for research and intellectual advancements. Buyers in a not-for-profit sector work within very tight financial constraints, and therefore access to high-caliber staff can be hampered by the inability to pay high salaries or to recruit suitably experienced trustees. Decision-making can be very slow due to complex government structures, and normal economic rational decisions may be clouded by strong-held values. Funding is moving from grant-based projects with light-touch supervision and loosely defined outcomes to much more tightly managed contract-based funding with payments by results. So access to normal funding routes like loans is restricted due to an unwillingness to lend to a risky social enterprise where action to recover the debt may result in bad publicity for the lender. Now here we can see some examples of trade agreements. So some information about the major trade agreements is the GATT, the GATT, was formulated in 1947. And its purpose was the substantial reduction of tariffs and other trade barriers and the elimination of preferences on a reciprocal and mutually advantageous basis. It existed through several rounds, negotiations until 1994, when it was replaced by the WTO, the World Trade Organization. In 2018, the EU consisted currently of 28 independent member states, with more waiting to join. And at the time of this recording, the UK was still a member of the EU. So what's the benefits to this? I mean, it makes distribution around the world cheaper, bringing harmonious trade between countries, which of course will lead to better customer-supply relations. And they can be international, multinational, or bilateral trade agreements. And they ultimately lower tariffs, eliminate quota restrictions, and remove barriers. Now, international trade has taken place in centuries, and over time, the risks that slowed down across boundary issues have been reduced. So the term trading bloc refers to an economic arrangement that's created among a group of countries. There are more than 30 major trading blocs and agreements, and have grown particularly fast since 1994, when the World Trade Organization was formed. The European Free Trade Association comprises Norway, Iceland, Switzerland and Liechtenstein, and it is linked to the EU in terms of trade regulations. And there's one in North America, the North America Free Trade Organization, which comprises USA, Canada and Mexico. But a free trade area is one that represents the least restrictive economic integration between its nations. So you can have free trade across the barriers or the boundaries of these countries, and there's no taxes, no tariffs and no quotas imposed. Now, the common market is the closest form of integration. So you've got a trading group with tariff-free trading among its members, and then a common external tariff on imports for non-members. and a collective regulation on quotas and other trade barriers. Commercial law is also drafted centrally and overrides the domestic laws of its member states. So there are a number of advantages and disadvantages of international sourcing. So it's important that we're aware of these in order to ensure the optimal decisions about where and how to source. But is your organisation willing to be associated with less onerous environmental constraints? Is it comfortable with the potential reputational damage associated with poor working conditions? Is shipping costs around the world compatible with its CSR policies? There are some types of issues that we need to consider. So the benefits of international sourcing is that you can get the availability of the required materials or skills, which does increase capacity and competitiveness. That will result in lower prices and cost savings. And you do have these less onerous constraints on things like the environment and labour compliance. The leverage we've got with our IT systems for virtual organisations and e-sourcing, and arguably it promotes the development of international trade and relations. And we know that from the public sector, it's compulsory to advertise within the EU. But the downside, of course, is you run the risk of exchange rate fluctuations. There's a higher sourcing and transaction cost. And any cost saving you make may create a risk elsewhere for reputational risk, compliance, or sustainability. You've got different legal frameworks and time zones and languages, as well as lead times and political exposure to risk, and any environmental impacts through the longer transportation through sea freight and air freight. When goods are imported, they need to be accompanied with the appropriate documentation that covers all aspects of deliveries. Imagine it to be a little bit like a passport for goods. Now, the correct documentation should enable the goods to easily pass from their point of origin to the point of destination. The documentation required does vary from country to country, so it's important that both the buyer and supplier have a really good understanding of the export and import requirements in relation to that local or international laws. Now, the methods used within the EU are documents that we use in the European single market that enable free and traceable movements of goods within its borders, and it includes firstly the T1 document. This must accompany goods that are in transit through the EU until they reach their final destination, which enables traceability. While travelling under this document, the goods are not subject to any duty charges, but will be when they reach their destination if duty exists. From an import and export licence, that may be required to permit the import or export of a particular product. The single administration document is only required for goods that are entering or leaving the EU, and it's not required for goods arriving from within the EU or those being transported outside of the EU. Predominantly used when manual processing is required in the event of a computer system failure. Users can electronically submit unit transits, that's UTs, and transport informational routers, TIRs, their declarations in lieu of the paper declarations to facilitate the easy movement of goods in transit. The procedure for the TIR applies in cases where goods are delivered to, transported from, or pass through EU member states, with this system allowing greater traceability of their movements. And the Customs Declaration Service is the system in the UK that replaced the previous system from the early 2019. The Customs Handling and Import-Export Freight, which was known as CHIEF. But users will submit electronic import and export requests, and it maintains an audit trail of previous requests and calculates tariffs and duty requirements on its behalf. Here are some more documents that may be required to facilitate the flow of international imports and exports. The purchase order. This is a request from the buyer to the seller, providing deliverable lines that the supplier can submit an invoice for payment against. The bill of lading is a document title that details what is required of those involved in transporting, carrying, and consigning goods until their point of delivery, and this is used for the transportation of goods across borders. Insurance cover will ensure the goods being transported to the buyer from the supplier or both may be responsible for ensuring that the goods are covered by a suitable insurance policy. This covers the value of the goods and should detail how it applies, such as the dates and the locations. The buyer must be sure of their responsibilities regarding the chosen policy and should ensure that it's adequate cover at the correct stages of its journey. A certificate of origin is a declaration that officially specifies the origin of a particular delivery of goods. It provides assurance for customs agents, as well as the buyer, that the goods have come from a particular country, allowing access to certain tariffs and duty reliefs. And finally, a carnet, a document that allows the temporary free movement of goods for a specified purpose within a designated boundary or along a set route, known as the administration carnet, so the ATA carnet. And goods must not remain in the country permanently. Throughout the use of a carnet, the person responsible for the goods should ensure that all goods are accounted for and apply to custom regulations of the countries they enter. Now here we can see Incoterms, which is a list of commercial rules that provide a recognised standard of trade understanding and terminology between buyers and sellers. It's used to describe the point when a delivery is no longer the responsibility of the selling organisation and the risk is transferred to the buyer. If you look at my YouTube channel, you will see a separate video specifically on Incoterms at the very beginning. So Incoterms are used to represent information when included in the contract. It's things like the point at which goods will be considered to have been delivered, which party is responsible for organising transport and what form this will take, which party pays to insure the goods and which is responsible for arranging this, which party is responsible for making duty and tariff arrangements and passage through customs. So this can take place, and it can replace, should I say, otherwise lengthy contract clauses. So if you look at the table on the screen, there is one at the top beginning with the letter E. The only one is the X works. The goods are considered delivered at the point of release from the supplier's premises. So essentially, if the buyer has to go all the way to the seller's premises to collect it, meaning the buyer bears all of the risk of the transport, customs and excise. The ones that begin with the letter F are where the seller is responsible for getting it to the port of departure. So it can be alongside the ship, it can be on board the ship. The ones that begin with the letter C, the seller is responsible for getting the goods to the port of arrival. Sometimes it includes insurance, sometimes it doesn't. So CIF does, cost, insurance and freight, but CRF is just cost and freight, so the buyer would have to pay the insurance. And the D terms get it all the way to the point that the buyer has asked for, which could be at a place, a terminal, or delivered duty paid. Now, there are dispute resolutions for problems in international contracts, and these can be quite difficult, such as which country's law applies to the contract. And the International Court of Arbitration will play a role in resolving international disputes. However, an agreement by both parties of the fact that this should be used should be included in the contract. So it will apply the rules of the International Chamber of Commerce. It appoints an arbitrator to scrutinise awards and fees, and it ultimately depends on goodwill. Now, there are various payment mechanisms that can be used in international trade. They carry different risks in relation to payment and delivery. Some are more beneficial to the buyer, such as an open account, and some are more beneficial to the supplier, such as cash in advance. So an open account, the supplier ensures the goods are delivered to the buyer long before payment is due. So it could be something like 90 days. A great deal of domestic trade is undertaken this way, and it's highly beneficial for the buyer, but it's not beneficial for the supplier as there's risks of not getting paid. An open account needs to be carefully managed to prevent cash flow problems for the supplier. The term time draft is a guarantee for payment from the buyer's bank. Sometimes it's ensuring that the exporting supplier retains the title of the goods until the point at which the importing buyer has receipted them. It's following confirmation that the goods have been received and the supplier is paid after a very short delay. That delay gives the buyer time to inspect the goods and ensure they're satisfied before paying. The supplier has the benefit of knowing that payment is guaranteed. Site draft again is a guarantee of payment from the buyer's bank that ensures the exporting supplier retains the title of the goods until the point in which the importing buyer has receipted and paid for them. So the supplier is paid for the goods as soon as they're received on site, and there can be no delay. A letter of credit is a guarantee provided by the buyer's bank to the supplier, stating that the exporting supplier will be only paid when the goods are delivered. This option supports the payment of the supplier, but it's favourable to the buyer as they're not obliged to repay the bank until the terms of the letter of credit are met, with all the required documentation provided. And finally, cash in advance. This payment is an advanced payment term. The supplier is paid for the goods before the buyer receives them. This benefits the supplier, but it poses a big risk to the buyer. And if the buyer doesn't receive the delivery because it's lost in transit, it may never be able to recover the money that it's paid the supplier. And that's the end of Learning Outcome 3. Thank you for watching.